Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Friday, July 11th, 2025, episode 435. The big picture. Let's talk about the big picture and the truth. Why talk about the big picture? Because there are so many things in the news today that it's easy to get caught up and just be overwhelmed by just the sheer volume of things, items, events, happenings in the news today. But in spite of the fact that there are all of these uh, noteworthy events in the news, there's still the truth, right? And what is that truth? And I want to talk about that a little bit as well. One of my problems growing up was that I got bored too easily. I'm not talking about being bored like having so many things to do and then saying I'm bored. It's just when I would study something, get into something, I would quickly get bored because I would realize, oh, okay, this is what they're going to do. This is what the rest of the field seems to be doing. Yeah, not interested in doing it, cool as it may have been. So, for example, physics, chemistry, the basics of it, right? The very basic intro level chemistry, physics. It was interesting. I mean, I really, biology especially, I really was interested, got interested by a lot of these intro level courses, but then you realize that it's pretty much that. That's what you're going to be doing all of the time. And I just, it was okay to study, but I couldn't see myself spending all of my time doing that. And I'm sure other people, if they wanted to do it, that's fine for them. But for me, it wasn't enough to hold my interest more than just a few courses, more than just a few courses. So I basically turned into a person who learned a little bit about everything. If there was something that I'd never done before, something that I'd never studied before, I would always look into it just to understand the basics. And this turned into a curiosity of how things work, which led to me asking why, the question why, all of the time. And it does so much so that it's part of my deconstruction method, which I have mentioned several times on this podcast. In other words, one of the questions you need to ask all of the time, with particularly when you're unfamiliar with a topic or an area, and especially when you think you know a lot about a certain topic, is the question why? Why do you think that? Why is it that way? Why do people think this way? Why do people make that conclusion? Just asking why to learn as much information as possible to really try to get a feel for what this field or what this work is all about. Sometimes it's a short story. You don't have to ask too many times. And other times, especially in academic pursuits, you're going to be asking why a lot. And the more that you ask why, the more it takes you down a narrow road. And this is pretty much what graduate research is all about in the humanities anyway, in the university. You keep asking why, and it keeps taking you down a path until no one has an answer to your question. And that becomes your dissertation research, right? You're like, well, why do people think this way? Well, I don't know. And so you're like, well, I'm going to look into it. And that becomes your PhD. Sometimes your questions will take you to a line of thinking that no one else thinks is worthwhile. And so you have to change your topic and maybe save that for another day. But no matter what, you're going down a narrow road. Now, the mistake that a lot of scholars, academicians, as they say, or PhDs make is thinking that their narrow road is the solution, is the method through which, or the principle, philosophy, that subjectivity, which will explain everything else in the world, right? But it doesn't do that, right? The roads uh, are as long as you want them to be, but generally, the wherever it takes you will basically affirm or support a certain agenda, right? And so most scholars that I've met, they'll ask the question why until they find a point where they can justify a lot of the actions that they want to take. You see this also in biblical scholarship, in churches, where they'll keep asking why until they reach a conclusion which either affirms something that they already believe or something they want to believe. And I've talked about this before in different contexts. So that road of asking why is as long as you want it to be. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe that this narrow, super narrow subjectivity is the way to understand everything else in the world. And maybe it does work sometimes for a little while until the world changes. And in which case, everything that you thought you explained and understood no longer exists, right? No one cares about it anymore. And so now what do? You're going to become a conservative. You're going to be hammering home the same point that you did 10 years before, but no one cares anymore because society has moved on from that point. And maybe this explains why a lot of people are obsessed with this concept of truth. In other words, I don't think they are really interested in learning what the truth is, but to find the truth, you know, and I get it, right? But the truth is so big that I don't think any of us could ever, within our lifetime, totally grasp what that truth is. I mean, we might have a sense of it, and subjectively speaking, we may believe that we know what it is, but we're just too small. We're just too limited. We're just too sort of narrow to be able to comprehend something as the truth, capital T, right? And so most of us, even the smartest of us, can only ever understand uh, little more than a sliver of what the truth might be. It's sort of like my race theory, if I were to use that as an example. Keep in mind that my definition of race is just simply a generalization from a specific characteristic, right? So you have a characteristic or a trait, and you create a generalization or a category with that characteristic, and bam, you have a race, right? You can be color, it can be gender, it could be by occupation, by your age, by your nationality, whatever. It doesn't matter. Um, and there are infinite number of categories. In other words, there are an infinite number of races. And all of them are, and you may want to try to understand the world from your very narrow, specific racial category. But the reality is that each individual is made up of an infinite number of categories, many of which we don't know, many of them we've forgotten, but nevertheless, we are the sum total of all of our possible racial categories. And all of them are acting against each other to produce the reality that we see. In other words, each person is, has within them a struggle of all these racializations to produce the individual. And then all the individuals are now working and acting against each other to produce the reality that we see. And it is in constant flux. I often make the analogy of a video and picture. So most people want a picture. It's like, tell me the truth. They're asking for a picture, a snapshot of reality that doesn't change. And once you know what the truth is, then you understand the rest of the picture. But once you understand that picture, it's, by the time you understand that picture, it's no longer reality because reality is more like a video. It is constantly moving, it's constantly changing. And so for most scholars, they develop a picture and then they describe the picture, which is why so many of them are irrelevant, or the significance or the application ability of that person's theories are so limited, right? Because they're talking about a picture, which is now in the past, whereas we're living in the present in a video, right? And what we need is information for the future, for things that are going to come. So if all of the events that we see on the news today, these are all data points, all right, no matter how big or small they are, and how many people are affected by these data points, that's all they are. They are data points. Points like uh, the points or dots in a Monet painting, a painting by Monet, who basically painted by like dots, right? Putting points on a canvas, and you step back and you see a painting. And they're really one of, if you haven't seen any of them, they're amazing. It's called impressionistic painting, I guess. And his style is called pointillism, right? So he's just doing dots. But so when you're up close, you're like, well, okay, a bunch of dots. But when you step back, you're like, wow, here we have a painting. And so all of these dots that we see in life, these are all data points, and they all come together to create a picture. Again, a picture, a moment in time. This is what's happening. So people forget about the big picture, the big painting, and they're focusing on the dot. And they forget that there is that bigger picture. And I'm sure there are other ways of expressing this. I'm sure better ways, but this is the way that I've basically come to terms with all of these events that are, because I was trying to think about what to talk about today. And there are so many things in the news uh, that it's kind of confusing, and you're like, okay, is there a theme? All right, let's talk about the big picture, right? And so what is that big picture? And so all events that we might hear about, not just in the news, but in our personal life, right? No matter how old you are, what is significant for you is a big data point in your big picture, right? So what I'm basically saying is that everyone's big picture depends on that person's subjectivity. Like what your picture looks like has a lot to do with how much information you have. But to that person, those events in that big picture, they are all significant. But to other people, how significant are they? Well, it's subjective. It depends on the person. So just run down a little bit longish kind of list of things I even heard about just today. The Epstein list, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, weapons, gold revaluation, right? Some people are saying it'll be revalued to $20,000 an ounce, right? Transgender rights, human rights, citizens' rights, taxes, student loan delinquencies of people over 60 years old, right? There are people who are over 60 years old who are delinquent in paying their college student loan debt. I mean, that was kind of insane for me to hear. Then you hear college towns are dying, right? College towns that exist only, that are able to exist primarily because there's a college in town, they're dying. You got Russia, we got China to talk about, we got BRICS. And then there's grocery bills, gas prices, home repair, clothes for growing kids, diet and exercise, aging, your health. And then you got that other stuff like astronomy, SpaceX, bullet trains, climate change. You know what? I mean, there are so many things, but believe me when I say that these are all data points in a ginormous global painting by Monet. To take all of these into consideration, like all of them and more into consideration, and to figure out how they all play against each other, how they fit against each other, that's God level activity, right? So I would say, like, to be able to comprehend all of this, well, we're talking about a God level activity. And you don't have to believe in God to go along with this, right? Even cosmologists believe in the unified theory, which some people will call the God theory. And I've talked about this before. Um, so a theory that explains everything, right? Once you know the theory, not only do you know the explanation of everything, but you also know what happened in the past. You know what will happen in the future. That kind of God level comprehension. So it's huge, right? So the big picture is infinite, right? And we are so finite. We're not even, there are trees that live longer than people, okay? That's how small we are in the grand scheme of things. And so how we perceive the big picture, it says a lot about your subjectivity. It says a lot about your perspective, how much you know, what your plans in life are, how far ahead do they go. And for some people, they go so far as, like Christians would be an example, life after death. And then you have to ask yourself, well, then what's my life before death? This is what makes truth so elusive and so subjective, right? Even this episode, I'm sure a lot of people will probably not listen because they already know what the truth is. And so you don't like it when other people say different things. Uh, we can make, and don't mistake me, I make truth assertions all the time for myself. But if I try to make truth assertions for other people, it doesn't get very far because their subjectivity is different, right? Their priorities, what is significant, what is important, what is not important, is different for other people. Even when I try to impress upon my kids certain priorities, they ignore me for the most part because their subjectivity is different. I also think they have that rebellious streak that I had as well, which is why I try to leave them alone as much as possible. But nevertheless, if I were to try to say, hey, this is important, they don't sit there and say, oh, wow, Dad, thanks for telling me my life has changed. It never is like that. It's just, oh, okay, well, all right, I'll keep that in mind, right? So any one of us can have a truth assertion, but because we kind of are comfortable with it ourselves, then that's as far as it gets. Uh, I don't think that other people will be ready to make what I think are truth assertions. Uh, I don't think I'd be able to present it in such a way that they would make them their truth assertions. And the difference, of course, is in subjectivity, outlook, shall we say, you know. And I think it's because people need to know what someone will say is the truth, and they get confidence from that. Like, I know the truth, right? I have the right belief, or I have the right interpretation. In order for me to assert something, to be able to say something, to be able to critique other people, right? So that's one way of doing it. And I find that even lots of other Christians, it's more that's what I sense. Maybe they'll express it in a different way, but that's the vibe I get. They want to know the truth, so then they can assert something. They can say, see, I know this, you don't, or my interpretation is better than yours. And I don't have that thing. I don't have that, how shall I say, desire to have the truth so I can lord it over other people. That's not my thing. So, an alternative from knowing the truth so I can be confident, I take comfort in the expectation that someone will have a better piece of information, right? Uh, if you approach life with an expectation, then what we do today, what we do now, we try to do the best thing given the information that we have, right? So if I claim to know this is true, then this is the best choice that I can make. even if it's not the choice I want to make, but with the information I have, this is, excuse me, the most responsible, forward-looking choice that I could make, right? And so we take comfort in that while expecting and hoping for something better in the future. Right. And so we're always looking for opportunity. We're looking for more information. We're looking for different ways of viewing the same body of information, looking at our big picture from a different perspective. So you might be tempted to pursue and complain about and ruin your life about the Epstein list, but then what about the BRICS Bank, right? Uh, so in other words, the bigger your picture, the more you realize that there's a lot more that might be far more significant than what you already believe is true. Now, obviously, everyone's subjectivity is different. And if you were someone who was actually trafficked by Maxwell or Epstein, then that becomes the crux of the way you see your big picture, right? But it's for you, not for everybody. And considering that all of us are always acting with our subjectivity against other people's subjectivities, then it can only go so far. Okay. Uh, but so keeping all of this in mind, this big picture and all these different subjectivities. So we who live in the United States or in any country in the world, why should you give loyalty to that government? Why should you obey? And a lot of people, to be fair, they don't have a choice, right? Either you obey or the government does violence to you. Okay, but it doesn't mean that you give loyalty to that government. And you see everywhere that people constantly trying to find a reason to give their loyalty to their government. And I think that's a wasted effort because again, subjectivity, none of them know who you are. And so therefore they don't care about your needs and wants. All they care about is what they need to do to get reelected or to stay in power. So my desire is to bring it all down just so that we can live with our own unique set of priorities to take care of business in our own lives and to navigate this world without all of the barriers, without all of the manipulations that government would put in front of us. This also helps people figure out truth faster. In other words, I believe that with less government interference in our lives, we would move on. Information would be undermined constantly and continually. And so bad information is constantly being sifted out so that we can get to better information. And all of the distractions and all of the distortions that we live under, they will be short-lived, right? It's sort of like insider trading in the stock market. The more regulations there are in the stock market, the longer the insider trading, the fraud, the Ponzi schemes, the longer they can go, right? But with free flowing of information, Ponzi schemes, fraud, cons, they are revealed very, very quickly. And so that's my analogy of saying, so in life, it's hard to know what is true and what is not true simply because lies are subsidized. Lies are protected through censorship and through regulations, right? Even this anti-Semitism push that we're seeing these days, right? That's a subsidized, protected effort, which prolongs distortions, which increases the pain and the cost of those distortions for much, much longer. And if we did not have the government interference into what we can and cannot say, then what happens is that people realize, oh, that's not anti-Semitic at all. And so you get on with your life, right? And so all of the costs, even the harm to people who are negatively affected by this anti-Semitism mindset, right? Positive and negative, right? That is also reduced. It's mitigated. It's not as bad as it probably is going to be, right? And so even there are some people who were murdered as a result of all of this stuff. And you saw it with the whole Trump thing as well. Lots of violence as a result of these distortions, weird prioritizations in the information that's disseminated. In other words, people forget that there is a bigger picture. And so the bigger your picture is, subjectively speaking, the way that you see the world, the bigger it is, the broader it is, the more people you consider before you make a conclusion, before you make an assertion, then the better those assertions will be, right? And people will benefit from them. The narrower your perspective of the world is, like, I know Kung Fu, and so therefore, I can tell you what you need to eat for breakfast, that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard people do similar things, maybe not in those terms, but that kind of idea, yeah, they get revealed as being ignorable. You don't have to pay attention to that because in your big picture, it's not very significant. And that's it for today. I just wanted to give an idea on how to come to terms with just all the cacophony of news events that are happening, everything that Trump is doing and how it affects our lives and the economy, other countries. It's enough to drive you mad. So when that happens, you just take a step back, remember what your big picture is, and get busy doing what you need to do. Remember what your personal priorities are in light of all of this information that you have gathered. But that's it for today. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I'll talk to you next time.